Powered by Century Ply, now with firewall technology.
Welcome back. Well, for now, the market is not doing too badly. You have to say the Bank Nifty is really batting for the bulls, holding up. The Nifty has also picked up pace from the lows of trade. It is in a very, very narrow range. But if you look at it, the low that we hit today was 16,444. We are back at 16,544. So that's about a 100-point recovery from the lows of trade. And a lot of banks are holding up. But the entire FMCG space is in focus. Jubilant Foods has a new CEO. We have, of course, the entire space, the input costs with the way they've been rising. Competition has been rising as well. What do you do with this sector on the whole, the QSR space particularly? Manoj Menon, the head of research and FMCG analyst at ICICI Securities, joins us now to talk about that. Manoj, thanks a lot for joining us. First, I want to understand your overarching view on the space itself. Given that there's been an underperformance of FMCG stocks in the last 12 to 18 months, how are you approaching it now?
Hi. So, you know what, we are living in interesting times in which, let's say, cheaper FMCG products and those companies are talking about a significant, adverse effects of price elasticity, essentially saying that volumes are difficult to come by. But at the same time, discretionary, by definition, is discretionary. Companies actually say their demand conditions are very robust. So I think, essentially the way we are approaching it is that it seems to be to do with, which part of the consumer basket, is impacted more because of inflation. And logically, it's the middle class and the, lower middle class, etc. So that's where the bulk of the volumes for an FMCG actually comes, just from a volume point of view. Whereas discretionary, products, including restaurants, including jewelry, large or retail, largely speaking, it's an urban-oriented, presence currently for discretionary, and also it is middle class plus, right? I mean, so I think, so we are in those sort of interesting times where I think the inflation is biting FMCG far more. Now, having said that, if you actually see the performance, somewhat mirroring this, what I'm trying to essentially say is that in consumer staples or FMCG, we do believe that, most of the negatives are actually priced in. Whereas in discretionary, most of the expected good news over, let's say, fiscal 23 and 24 is also there in the price.
Right, that's interesting because you're talking about a K-shaped sort of recovery that everyone's been talking about. The rich are getting richer and they are buying a lot more discretionary products, where the poor are, getting hurt and further hurt by the inflationary pressures that we're seeing. So what exactly do you think is your view on inflation itself right now? Because there's been a protracted effort against inflation. The government is doing things, the RBI is doing things, and not just in India, globally as well. We're looking at reducing input prices. So do you think the worst of margin pressures is behind the companies? And in light of that the points that you just made, what would your top picks be?
Yeah. Mangalam, so look, inflation, you got to approach, in multiple ways, actually. So, for example, when typically we talk about inflation, the normal reference is about the input inflation, which kind of impacts the gross margin. You know what? There are companies who actually are significant beneficiaries of inflation as well. So, for example, the larger FMCG companies tend to gain volume market share during times like these. It's really not a bad situation to be in. That's point number one. Point number two, from a consumer point of view, when everything is inflationary, or rather I would say, the imported inflation of fuel, etc., it's a simple case of, managing or rather balancing the budget at a household level, right? I mean, which means there will be prioritization. So in that context, the way we are seeing currently, some price increases have already happened in the last 3 to 6 months. Inflation has been ahead of the price increases, which actually means that, this year, which is the fiscal 2023, we do believe that, on a like-for-like basis versus last year, the worst of margin pressure is yet to come. So that's how we are approaching. And I don't think, the worst is behind from a reported point of view. Having said that, most companies, has called this out, saying that the June quarter and September quarter, gross margin pressure, is likely to come. So to that extent, I am of the view that the market understands it and probably has priced it in. That's where you started off by talking about the underperformance of the sector.
Okay. Manoj, hi. I wanted your thoughts on the entire paint sector, because that's been discussed because of incremental competition coming in, that, this is the geo moment in the paint sector with Grasim entering. What is your sense? Do you think that Asian Paints is going to have to cut its prices significantly? There could be price competition, margins could be impacted. Not to mention there is also that layer of uncertainty due to crude.
Okay, so look, we actually had a downgrade of the paint sector way back in October. It sounds like history, but it was almost like 9 months back. Honestly, if you call it a geo moment, in May 22 or June 22, honestly speaking, we had visibility of what is likely to come almost a year back. So that's point number one. That's also the reason, if you see some of the paint stocks has largely been flat point to point, the market is slowly pricing, let's say, the incremental competition in the way we see it. That's point number one. The second aspect here is that, look, it's very clear over the last 20, 30 years of available history that paint sector is one of those rare industries which has got genuine entry barriers. Now, it could be the product, it could be the profit pool, what is available, it could be the distribution, etc., etc. So to that extent, I really don't think any new entrant can come and have a price competition, etc. The only context to note here is that when you're a large player, coming in, and when you also have, let's say some of the existing, companies attempting a turnaround. For example, an AkzoNobel has been attempting a turnaround. Kanchan Arolak has got a new CEO recently. Berger continues to perform well, and Asian, as usual, continues to perform well in the business given the market context, etc. So things are likely to be difficult. That's what I would leave it there. But if you actually ask me, for any player to reach a material size, forget about scale, it will at least take 3 to 5 years.
Okay.
All right. Manoj, also now that we're talking about all different sectors, let's talk about the QSR space. This morning itself, you've written on, QSRs being better placed to implement price increases with relatively lower adverse effects of price elasticity. And this was something that was echoed by Amit Jatia as well, who joined us on Friday, saying that they actually turn out to be better value propositions for consumers during inflationary times. Those who are used to having expensive food at restaurants will now downtrade to McDonald's as against, the barrier that a lot of people would have during inflationary times where they would not uptrade to McDonald's. Having said all of this, what are your thoughts in the QSR space? Your top picks there. And Jubilant FoodWorks as well. They've announced a new CEO. The overhang is away.
So, look, we relatively like the restaurant space, for one simple reason. I'll give you a statistic. So 15% of Domino's customers approximately account for, let's say, more than 50% of revenue. So what I'm trying to say is that classical marketing, restaurants is one industry in India at this point in time. You can call it underpenetrated. The other way to also say it is that it only caters to a small subset of consumers, right? Or let's say, put it this way in the marketing concept, it's a category where it has got heavy user dependence. Now, in that context, when you actually see, what Mr. Jatia, what you just told me about what Mr. Jatia said, etc. McDonald's, yes, definitely a beneficiary of that. But the overall context to note here is that there is a 10-12% price increase which has happened till now. Demand seems to be holding up currently. But history tells us that, there is some impact which can happen if there is further price increases and if also the overall macros doesn't really change. So the limited point here, at this point in time, restaurant industry appears to be relatively better off. But we got to watch the space very, very carefully because ultimately, at some point in time, if inflation persists, it will affect discretionary also. So in that context, eating out or even ordering in is somewhat discretionary, right? It's really not a necessity. So there will be some rationalization which can happen potentially 6 months down the line. Now, we continue to like the space. We continue to like Jubilant FoodWorks. It's one of our topics in restaurant, simply because while there are now 5 or 6 restaurant listed companies in India, Jubilant has got the best store metrics. It has got one of the lowest capex per store and one of the highest, average daily sales. So that essentially means it is one of the best models. And the current guidance by the company of opening 250 stores going into fiscal 23, it's essentially a 15%, sort of a store addition as well. So it's kind of, tells us the confidence what they're sitting in currently. And about the new CEO, we also saw the announcement. We'll wait for, him to join in a few months' time, and then we'll appropriately have a view at that time.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense, right? I mean, you don't want to preempt his performance, so you kind of perhaps, wait to give us your view. All right, Manoj, we'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot for joining us. I appreciate your thoughts on the entire QSR space. So definitely demand has picked up and many of these companies, the volume and growth trajectory looks good from here. That's the word coming in from ICICI Securities. By the way, Tata Motors in focus.